Hello, welcome back to the GM's Guide. I'm your host, Dan Felder, your kind and merciful GM. And today we have a very special guest to talk with us all about world building. Mark, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi guys, my name is Mark Yohalem. I write stories for computer games by night, and by day I'm a lawyer. I was a prosecutor until recently, and now I work at a law firm. So I'm kind of like a lame version of Daredevil. Rather than being a superhero by night, I just write computer game stories.
So, your game Primordia, you've gotten a lot of attention for, and it's how it first called me to you in the first place. Primordia is a point and click adventure game that I picked up during the last Steam sale. And as I was going through my games and I started playing Primordia, my power went out. Still had my laptop going, and it was really, really cold outside. So my heat was, of course, dead as well. And so as I am playing, I start realizing it's getting very, very cold. And I cannot pull myself away from this game, which, if you've played a point and click adventure game, you might love them, as I do. But they don't necessarily hold you spellbound because you get stuck on puzzles. There's a lot of wandering around, wondering what to do, etc. And this is a classic point and click adventure game. And yet, despite that, I am soon trying to play this point and click adventure game through thick winter gloves because I cannot leave my computer. And I remember writing a review saying as much. Mark commented on the review saying, "Thanks very much for the review." I wasn't just gushing either. I was talking a lot about some of the strengths and weaknesses of the puzzles. You responded extremely well to that. And I thought, I wonder if I can talk to this guy. He's so interesting. The world building is so interesting. The characters are so interesting. The presentation is so interesting. And so I reached out to Mark, and here we are. So, Mark, can you explain what Primordia's setting is all about?
Yeah, it's basically a post organic, post apocalyptic setting. It's not really a future of our Earth. It is the future of a world on which there were humans. Humans built thinking machines, and then the humans wiped each other out. And what's left behind are these robots that were purpose built for purposes that made sense in a world with human beings. And now they're in a world that no longer has human beings. The machines no longer have their creators, and they no longer really have the environment in which they were meant to function. Some indeterminate period of time has passed since all life has ceased, and now the machines themselves are starting to break down. And the game is really about two robots who live by themselves out in the wasteland, who are forced, after their power core is stolen, to go on an adventure to try to find a new source of energy for the airship they live in. So that's sort of the broad outline of it.
Right at the start, the first thing that really hooked me on the setting was opening the Book of Man and talking about how man must be a perfect machine because man created robots to serve him and inherit his earth. And I thought that was just a really, really interesting thing, that a man must be, therefore, a being of infinite perfection, infinite logic, infinite durability. And then, of course, shortly after, you discover a skeleton of a human in the desert. um, who the robots don't even recognize is a person, which is a great way to express that they really have no idea whatsoever what this man guy even is. They just assume it's some sort of primitive robot. And that just seemed like a very, very interesting thing that made me lean forward in my seat. So, can you talk a little bit about what you feel makes Primordia's setting stand out? What makes it work so well?
That's a tricky question. Let me start by where the idea that grabbed you came from. My great aunt was a poet, I guess a professional poet, you would say. And one of the poems she wrote was called The Inheritors. And it starts with a stanza. I'm probably going to get parts of it wrong. But something like, I sing of the race that came to be after man's brief tyranny over all beasts ceased, and we became a theory in another species' prehistory, endowed as theories often are with false glories and iniquities. The truth is, we lost our vision, and with faith and fission lit one blaze too bright. The world will never see something. I can't remember how it goes from there. But the sort of the germ of the primordia idea was this notion that after human beings cease to exist, what would people think of us? And you look around at the incredible things that human beings have done to the planet, for better and worse, and someone coming after would really think that this was the work of supernatural beings, not of the flawed people that we are. And so part of where I started from with Primordia is this idea of an inability of one alien intelligent race of machines to understand another alien intelligent race of human beings. And so they ascribe both glories and iniquities to them that really aren't true. When you say that the reason why, when Horatio, who's the hero of the game, assumes that humans were perfect machines, that actually minimizes the things that human beings have done, which wouldn't be that extraordinary for a perfect machine to do, but really are extraordinary for 5 to 6 foot tall, physically frail, very mortal beings to accomplish. And so I think one thing that sort of grounded the setting was that dissonance of having the protagonist be an outsider looking in at us, the player, and sort of how that goes. Um, and it seems like that's maybe part of what grabbed you at the outset, although I'm not sure that explains the whole setting.
Yeah, it doesn't explain the whole setting, of course, but one of the things that I like to talk about in terms of a setting's power is that a good concept, this is just, of course, my perspective, and I'd love it if you disagreed, but a good concept for a setting, because people pitch me worlds and ideas all the time, is that you explain the basics, and from that basic idea, people can imagine more information than what you've told them. They can say, oh, I can see what this would be like then, and maybe that implies something about this, and so on. And with the basic idea that you set up in the start, I can say, oh, it's post-apocalyptic world run by robots. And I understand what that's like. And then you start playing, and you start showing a little bit more unique, and a little bit more unique. And I think the first thing that really grabbed me was, again, right at the start where they say, like, well, are you going to pray to man for a miracle, boss? Crispin says, or words to that effect. And he says, we are man's miracle. I just hope that's enough. I thought, that's a very interesting parallel of what we're dealing with machines. Like, we create miracles effectively. And I see how that evolved out of what you were talking about. And so that perspective, from the robot's perspective, started making me very interested in these robots as characters. And I think one of the most gripping characters to me right from the start was your own robot priest that you ever faithful Leo built that came out shortly after the opening.
Well, I want to roll back slightly to the question you posed, which is, this idea of a basic concept where people sort of understand and can immediately envision the world based on a limited amount of information. This may be boring, but I agree with you 100%. At least as far as I know what you're saying, I agree with it 100%. What I would describe it as is keyframing, which is an animation concept, which maybe maybe your listeners know, and so this might be boring, but the basic idea is that when you're animating something, you want to catch the moments in the animation where the motion turns and when it's most dramatic. And on like an old Disney movie or a Miyazaki movie, the keyframing was what the very best animators would do. And then you would have people who would go in and fill the frames in between the keyframes. You actually don't need the frames in between the keyframes. So on the current game project I'm working on, it's a game called Fallen Gods. And the combat animations that we have, for cost reasons essentially, are like 4 frames of animation. But they're very smooth, despite being so limited in their frames. And the reason why is that the guy who's animating it is a fantastic animator. And so he, in those 4 frames, tells your brain everything you need to know what the whole motion was, and then your brain fills in the rest. And you can contrast that to a more amateurish kind of animation, which is often hundreds of frames of animation, just done sequentially. So, the person doesn't think about where the animation is going to end. It just moves the foot a little and a little and a little and a little and a little, and that's how you get your walk frame or whatever. Um, and when that happens, you can have hundreds of frames and it still doesn't look right. And so, in building a setting, I think it's those keyframes that are so important, um, both from the standpoint of the GM or the writer and from the standpoint of the player, because it means that you don't need an hour of exposition. You just need 30 seconds of exposition, and the player's brain can fill in the rest.
Yeah, that's particularly noteworthy in games because we need that sense of constant participation and interaction in order to drive curiosity. Like, there's a saying that in games, you have to be the guy leaning forward. I used to run a game lab, as I mentioned on this podcast before, and a lot of players, it didn't really matter if you were an experienced gamer or not. If I was trying to get you into a new game, which I had to do for many class assignments. People had to basically play games. It was like a library for video games, as working into different coursework at the university. And it didn't matter how experienced somebody was. What mattered was whether they were willing to lean forward and try to figure out and fill in a blank. Then that was really, really powerful to me. For example, I was having people play Portal a lot. That was one of the games that was required for classwork that I recommended. And some people were absolutely incapable of solving the most basic problem. Like problems that I've seen like not 5-year-olds, but like fifth graders solve. And they're in college. I know that they can solve these problems. But the thing is that they just, when confronted with an obstacle, they kept asking, what do I do? What do I do? Whether audibly or not. They wouldn't lean forward and try to figure out and fill in the blank. And for a gamer, that's alien. You really evoke that curiosity, especially in somebody who's probably playing a point-and-click adventure for any reason. And suddenly our brains want to fill in the gaps, and that connection is so powerful. I haven't done my podcast on Revelations yet, in terms of the big plot twists and reveals and how to make them work. But one thing that really stood out to me that I made a note for to talk about during that was the reveal that you have about, and don't worry, this isn't a plot twist, about where the last names of the robots come from. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so the robots have patronymics, which are like patronymics for humans.
Fabronymics.
So, like, Horatio built Crispin, his sidekick, and so Crispin is Crispin Horatio built. And at least theoretically, this could go on for multiple generations. So you could have, if Crispin built, Dan Felder, then it would be Dan Felder, Crispin built, Horatio built, or something like that. Although in the game, they never go back more than one generation, in part because I just thought it would get too wordy. And the genesis for that was actually a trip I took to Iceland 15 years ago, where they still use patronymics. They don't have family names. Mm-hmm. So, like, I spent time with a guy whose name was Benedict Astrader Friederson, and his daughter was, Astrid Benedict's daughter, and so forth. And it was just one of those things that stuck with me because it's a part of our world that is at once familiar and alien. We still have all sorts of patronymics in English, like Johnson, but we don't use them as patronymics anymore. And so, it's one of those things where you achieve this uncanny effect by having it at once familiar and alien. And, I think the best uncanniness you can really get is when you look at things in our own world that satisfy those same two criteria.
That's a great point. I'm actually revisiting Harry Potter right now, and I've been noticing that formula used extensively. Just, here's something we're used to. What can I apply to it that's a little bit off, that'll make people interested? And just doing that over and over again. And it really is a very effective way of doing world building. I think that's one reason that urban fantasy has become such a pulpy genre, because you can put kind of anything. And it doesn't really matter if you're very good at world building into an urban setting, and it's like, oh, 90% of it. So it's going to be fine.
Yeah.
It's actually very, very effective. And of course, when you do it really, really well, that's great. But it's definitely an easier genre to world build when you're trying to create a completely just alien environment. Now, one thing I want to talk about, though, is also the way you presented that information. It must be very, very tempting. In fact, I know it's very tempting because I do writing for games and I do design all the time. Like, that's my day job. Um, and I know it's very, very tempting to immediately dump out all your cool ideas onto the player as efficiently as possible because you want to hook them, you want to show off all your cool stuff. And I know this is a common error because I see it a lot. And also, when I was commenting on a new writer's questions in a writer's group, my first advice was whatever you do, don't get distracted by your cool ideas. Focus on the player experience. And it got like, that was like a very simple comment, and it got like a billion thumbs up. And I was like, this must be something a lot of people struggle with. So, one thing I want to talk about was the way that you reveal it is at the start you have people referring to themselves with their full names, like I'm Horatio Nullbuilt, and it was like Horatio Nullbuilt. Okay, Built is a robot-y name. Null just sounds kind of sciency. It's a nice name. But then, once they actually get to the city of Glass and Light Metropole, he introduces himself as I'm Horatio Nullbuilt, and this is Crispin Horatio Built. And immediately I got it. Oh, that's what those names mean. And that was so much more powerful than just starting off with that information, because it let me, again, see a thing that I was already familiar with, and then only afterwards learn that there was an extra layer of logic behind it. And I think that illusion is one of the most powerful ways to create a sense that there's more beneath the surface that we haven't seen yet. And that's why I believe when you do enough of things like that, people tend to assume that everything you do has a meaning, because they keep getting exposed to things that they did not realize had a meaning until you were happy enough to let them in on that secret, if they were paying enough attention. And so then they assume, well, if that had a meaning, then everything must have a meaning. And so I think that's one reason why people assume there's this deep, rich Tolkien universe, just by using that clever presentation over and over again.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I would add a thumbs up to your comment about not oversharing with the player, but it's very difficult because maybe we'll have time to talk about this more later, but I think one thing that's really important when you're building a setting is to immerse yourself in it. And when you do that, you make all these interesting discoveries. And of course, it's human nature to want to share those discoveries with the world. And so the easiest way to do that is through expository dialogue. And incidentally, players are not innocent here themselves. If you put an expository dialogue option in front of a player, there's no player out there who won't take it. And I think particularly in role-playing games, the computer role-playing games, it's become really a vicious cycle where the players want deep lore, the writers are proud of their settings, and so they're happy to furnish the deep lore. And so you end up with these interminable dialogue trees where you can ask 15 follow-up questions on every topic of the world, and it's all neatly sketched out. But it's all just sort of like boring and not the best way to present information. But it's difficult. I think Primordia probably has some points where it's too expository, and I wish we'd cut it back. But it's hard to do that because you fall in love with all these random details. I do think the best way to do it is to find a way to imply the thing that you want to tell someone about. And when you become really, really familiar and immersed in your own setting, sometimes you do those implications without even thinking about it. Because whatever, that the air is now unbreathable on the surface, and so when your protagonist goes to the surface, he puts on a gas mask. And you don't even stop to say, this is because now the composition of the atmosphere is blah, 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 blah. It's second nature to you that that's why it's happening, and it's real to you. And so it becomes real to the player, and the player is intrigued by the fact that the protagonist is putting on a gas mask or whatever it is. Much more intrigued than if you got the chemical composition of the environment.
Absolutely. I think that your discussion of basically the creative suicide pact of player interest and expository dialogue is right on the nose. One thing that really occurs to me here, just even talking about that, is the level of fill in the blank. Again, coming back to the keyframe idea, is that psychologically, people love to learn. They just hate being taught. That's one thing we deal with in tutorials a lot. People really love to learn. They love to figure things out. Evolutionary, we're hardwired for that sense of discovery. But when you tell someone something, our brains are also hardwired to try to resist that information. We can't just immediately, somebody says, oh, that's safe to eat. And then we immediately go, oh, okay. And you go, eat that. Your brain has to be its own defense attorney. I mean, I know you were a prosecutor, so maybe you don't like defense attorneys. But the moment that you get that, when you're teaching somebody something, our brains kind of cross-reference that with, I need to resist that information. But if you suggest something, our brains try to make sense of that and try to follow it along. So as counterintuitive as it is, telling someone information is probably the least effective way to get them to actually know, remember, and value that information, because our brains are hardwired to try to find flaws in it and are trying to pick it apart.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think your point about teaching something people resist. I mean, when you're told thou shalt not do this or thou shalt do this, that is someone is asserting mastery over you, and so you have this sort of power struggle that if someone tells you don't touch that pot or you'll burn your hand, well, the only way to prove that you are a free human being is to burn your hand. Uh, Whereas, if someone says, you might want to look at the pot and learn something about it before you touch it, you're not being defied to do the task. And I think, the thing I would add as an additional factor here is games reward people for behaviors, and those rewards can also create sort of neurotic player behavior. And I'll give an example from Primordia. So one idea I had was we would have this kiosk with information in it, and I would just keep writing topics for it until I couldn't come up with any other topics any player could possibly want to ask about. And so the theory was that the kiosk would be greater than any player would ever use. Maybe some, neurotic, freezing, American expat in Brussels would check it all. But generally speaking, no one would do it. But then the publisher correctly said that we needed achievements for the game. And so one of the achievements was to find every topic in the kiosk. And then the kiosk's function totally transformed from being a fascinating, well, maybe not fascinating, but at least a voluntary excursion the player could take, to taking on this quality of being like an Easter egg hunt or a Pokemon hunt where you've got to find everything. And people didn't like the kiosk, or many people didn't like the kiosk because it felt like a chore. And I think, that's part of also what goes into this, lore suicide pact, as you described it, that players think that if they don't pick every dialogue option, they're going to miss a 50 experience point bonus or a magic ring or some other opportunity to get something out of the game. And so they're very reluctant to miss those opportunities.
Yeah, it's actually there's like 20 things I want to say about that right now, because that hits directly on what I spend all my time working on and thinking about. But I will restrain myself. I'll just settle for two. First was I was just been playing Dark Souls. I'm doing a 100% playthrough run because I just want to say, yo, you beat Dark Souls, but did you beat Dark Souls? And and I'm having to deal with a lot of optional bosses and content right now, and I keep staring at the screen and going, really? You expect me to do that? And I know that really they just say like, well, it's not mandatory. You don't have to do this. Like you don't have to. I know that we killed your spawn point and reset without any warning and reset you to this thing that you have to keep running across the rafters every single time to fight an optional boss that one hit kills you if they ever hit you. But you don't have to do it. And I'm just like, no, I have to do it. And that's exactly how I felt like. And I did do it. But that's just really amazing. Just the optional content. You feel like it's beaten you. And that's in a game where the cost is like in hours, not just in seconds, to click an additional dialogue option. But also, it's an adventure game. The first rule I give in survival to getting people into the genre is click on every option, because you never know where the hint's buried, and pick up everything, because you never know what you're going to need. So
Yeah.
it's so genre-wise, it's not working well for that either. Final thing I want to mention on that is a really big travesty in a story-based game was The Witcher. In the original Witcher, they gave a little whenever you completed a romance, they gave out a like small painting of the romance character that was sort of added to your inventory. And they thought, oh, it's like a little bit of it's like a photograph, but it's the fantasy version equivalent of that. It's like a little memorabilia, and that's great. Unfortunately, players saw this and they're like, how do I get all the romance cards?
Right.
And that never would have happened otherwise. So like, okay, we've just destroyed the soul of our game for a lot of our players. And so it's amazing when you present this to it, players immediately thought, I need to collect all these things. How do I get all the romances? And that lost all of the interest of actually trying to figure out who you actually care about in the game.
Yeah. I mean, I was just reading a sort of an interesting plea by an RPG fan to other players saying that people should just play the game as they want to and not try metagaming the game. Uh, and I mean, it was an interesting thing to read because his diagnosis was absolutely correct. You know, when players make decisions in these games, it's not usually the decision that they think is sort of the right decision that they just want to do. It's they're always thinking 5 steps ahead. You know, is this going to give me Paragon points or Renegade points? Is this going to get me in closer with this NPC so I can unlock more backstory? You know, and things like that. And it is really difficult as a designer to think about how you avoid those problems because they're endemic in any system where there are rewards, players are going to want the rewards. And if there aren't rewards, then players are going to be annoyed that they aren't there. So I'm not sure what the easy fix there is. I mean, it's a little bit off topic from world building, but not entirely off topic because the same completionist impulses that apply to sex cards or kiosk entries or Dark Souls bosses, you know, you'll see it on like 100% map completion and RPGs as well and things like that. And your setting ends up becoming, you know, just like a series of items of sites to check off on a sightseeing checklist as opposed to something to immerse yourself in.
Absolutely. Now, it actually, I would say, relates to world building. I mean, well, everything relates to everything. But one way that it relates to world building is in how it creates the player's mindset. And if you can express the world's desires mechanically, there's a lot of benefits that come out. Like, for example, we're talking about at this point of the podcast series, I'm following my creative process as I created a campaign called Raven Shadow, and it's a horror setting that has a lot of really scary darkness and then small points of light. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to create a sense of that the dark, big, scary world out there was dark and scary, and players would have to keep trying to find their way back to these little patches of effectively sacred ground. It's a bit different than that in the setting, but it's the best way to get a quick idea across. So what I did was I created a mechanical incentive to make them want to go back to hallowed ground. What they did was there was a system of afflictions that when players would keep getting hurt and get some significant permanent debuffs on their character. So you'd start getting, conditions called like, broken spirit, or you'd get like a shattered limb or things like that. Not necessarily always that extreme, but you'd start racking up debuffs, and players hate debuffs. -1 to all your skill checks. You hate that. You always are constantly imagining. Players, humans are massively loss averse, and they're always having to roll that die and apply that -1 to every single die roll, and they're always imagining, well, what if I just roll 1 below? It's just absolutely horrible. And they're just starting to accumulate these things, and they can't. And the thing was, you get those all the time in lots of games. But I made it so that you could not actually heal them outside of hallowed ground. And that mechanical incentive immediately made players want to do what their characters should want to do. I mean, players know that they're supposed to be monster slaying, awesome people. And so they not necessarily feel a pull to hallowed ground if they could just camp out really securely in the woods and rest up and then go do something else. But if they are getting all these debuffs, the longer they're away, the more they want to get back. And that ended up working extremely well. The main thing is you need to keep your characters and your players in alignment with what the game is asking them to do. One thing that I talked about in an article actually related to this, and which also comes into mind with the setting, is you don't want to make anything too interesting that your players can't directly engage with or find out about.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I actually think Primordia has a little bit of a problem in this regard, which is that Horatio essentially doesn't want an adventure. He's reclusive, and what he wants is to live a reclusive life. Conditional to doing that is that he gets his power core back. But if he could get his power core back by, walking 30 feet, digging in the sand, picking it out of the sand, and walking back home and plugging it back in, he would be delighted. That would be his ideal experience. Whereas if that were the course of the game, we wouldn't be having this conversation because you would have not had a positive experience with Primordia, and it probably never would have sold 10 copies. And so, it creates this friction that builds as the game goes on. And I think some players rightly reacted negatively to that they just felt like it was frustrating having a character who didn't want to be on the adventure because they wanted to be on the adventure. And what you're talking about is sort of the flip side of that, which is players don't feel any kind of fear of the unknown without some mechanical backing to that, in the way that the character should feel a fear of the unknown, or fear of anything else. And so how you figure out how to create that synthesis is really hard. I mean, I remember years and years ago, there was a total conversion of Doom, the original Doom, that made it into an Aliens game, like the Aliens movie by Ridley Scott. And it was the only game I've ever played where I went in, like, opened some door, and beyond it was this, alien infested room, and I just ran and thought to myself, oh, I'm not going in there. Well, that would be insane. I'm not going in there. And, that was like, it was very primitive graphics and limited sound effects and stuff. But, they managed to achieve that sense that I was going to die in the game. I was going to lose the progress I had made. And, for that instant, I felt exactly like the Space Marine or whatever ought to feel when confronted with this. Whereas in a normal experience of playing Doom, I mean, you might be annoyed that you're about to get killed by invisible demons or whatever, but you don't have any kind of the sort of existential horror that the character would be having. And so I think you're right that you do need to figure out mechanically how do you bring the character and the player in sync with what you're telling them is going on with the world.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. So I do have a question that I'd like to lead back into. What key factors would you say define a well-designed world or setting for a game? And what are some examples you admire? So one more time, what are the key factors, or at least some key factors, that define a well-designed world or setting for a game? What are some examples you admire? I know that last time, well, not last time, but a little bit earlier, you were worried that you might be boring us with Theorycraft. And this podcast is Theorycraft, the podcast. Like, most of my most popular episodes are, here are 40 minutes of me talking about one element of story structure and applying it to RPGs. So feel free to go nuts.
I guess I would start by saying that there is a little bit of a chicken and egg question. But if you know what you want the kind of player experience to be in terms of what the player can do, Can he cast fireballs? Can he swing a sword? Can he hack computers? Things like that. Once you have a sense of what you want the player to be doing, it is essential that the game world be a game world in which the things that the character and the player can do uh, are sort of the most richly rewarding things in that game world. Uh, I think there is some degree to which you can be sort of overly fan servicey or encouraging munchkinism, or there you can take it too far, but not usually. Usually, I think the mistake that designers make is that you end up with this universe that has all this interesting stuff going on in it, and then the player can't really do anything. Um, and like whatever, that's sort of like H.P. Lovecraft's shtick, and it works within fiction and within that one setting, sort of. But I think generally speaking, uh, again, starting with talk about computer games because it's different with the PMP setting. But I think the player and the player character are really going to be the center of the experience. And so, you want a world that will provide many, many opportunities to do the things the player can do, wants to do, and so forth. So I'll give you an example of what I think is a bad, poorly designed setting, a fairly poorly made but very popular game, which is The Longest Journey and Dreamfall. So those games, the settings are perfectly neat, even if they're just sort of lifted from Piers Anthony. But they're neat. But they're not settings in which a crazy person who's like a hoarder and a tinkerer and neurotic is going to be a hero. And that's the adventure game player. That's who you are, right? You're someone who steals anything that's not nailed down. And if it's nailed down, then you just steal a hammer and everybody else can steal it. And so, like, you have to sort of think about, like, who is the hero going to be in this setting? And those games are like, the hero is like an investigative reporter or like a college student who's majoring in art. And it's sort of like, they're just not suited to what the player's expectations are, what the world sort of offers, and what the game offers. And the result of it is that if you sort of read a walkthrough of those games, they are preposterous. They don't sound anything like a heroic story or a fantastical story or a compelling story. They read like a child sort of who's just had her wisdom teeth pulled and is hallucinating.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's what tends to happen when you have a setting that doesn't sort of complement the player. The other thing I would say is that I think almost any setting can be a good setting, but the creator has to really love the setting. Sometimes what you see, I think, is people say, like, this is a commercially successful setting. Let's duplicate it. And we'll make sufficient changes that it's not an infringement, but, we're going to take everything that we like from it and try to, give the player the same thing with a slightly different spin. And I think the problem with that is the keyframing ends up being wrong, right? Because it doesn't come from someone who has sort of immersed himself or herself in something and created it from the ground up. It comes from someone who's trying to reverse engineer someone else's product.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were done. No, continue.
The last thing I was just going to say, you did invite me to ramble about theorycraft.
Please, I just thought you were done.
I think you want to immerse yourself in the genre. So, for example, it never came to fruition, but I was making a space opera computer game. And I read 97 space opera novels over the course of a year. and read all of the space opera comic books I could find, watched all of the space opera television shows I could find, and the movies, which instantly I was basically like so sick of the genre by the end of it that maybe I OD'd. But the reason I did that was that part of what games offer players is the opportunity to be the hero of the stories that they've otherwise been exposed to in non-interactive media. And when you really immerse yourself in the source material, whether it's going to the like Appendix N or whatever it was in the original Dungeons and Dragons, or if you look at the manual to Star Control, they have a list of works that inspired them. If you sort of get into those works, you start to see consistent themes and elements, and you start to understand how those elements and themes work, and those are what the player is going to expect. Maybe not consciously, but subconsciously, they're going to expect, a warrior race who are like the Klingons or whatever, things like that. And, then you're not just reverse engineering something. I think you're at that point transforming it with your own creativity, but you've got all of the fundamental building blocks of the genre with you. And I think that's what Tolkien essentially did with high fantasy, is that he took Celtic myths, German myths, Norse myths, folklore, English fairy tales, Arthurian romances, all these sources, and immersed himself in them, and then created something new out of those materials. But he started by mastering the materials. Anyway, that was a long answer.
No, it's great. I mean, the funny thing is, dear audience, Mark has not heard my latest podcast when I talk about the fact that you should become a student of your genre and swallow everything you possibly can. But so, this is fantastic, getting this sort of post-episode endorsement. Because, yeah, I am a huge fan of diving as deep as you possibly can into your genre. I know a lot of authors actually are worried that their minds will become corrupted or something by oh, that's how he did it, I need to do it my way. And it's yeah, architect, I'm building a hotel. Let me never go near a hotel for the next, however many years. No, if you're at all worried about getting completely swamped by somebody else's vision, the answer is to consume everything you can, not just one person's idea. So one thing I like to do is I like to consume plot synopses as well, because you can go through them lightning fast. You can read hundreds of plot synopses of event structures, and again, you get the keyframes if the synopsis is written well. You get to fill in the blanks and apply your own creativity to what you think should be happening. And when you do that, I mean, a great way to get something creative is to improperly copy something else. Not in terms of doing a poor job, but in terms of only finding out the surface ideas and then filling in with the rest of what you think it is. A lot of this great cosmic horror I created was done before I ever had actually read any Lovecraft, when all I knew was just the basic ideas of Lovecraft. And applying those, applying those in my own way ended up being extremely, extremely effective. One thing I'd like to mention as well in talking about the copying of settings, because one thing I really do is I do really advise people to look at something and then try to do their own take on it. But one thing that is important to that, and one thing why a lot of this sort of aping of existing source material fails, I think, is that people don't understand why it works. So people just try to copy the surface details and then change some of those details because they need to do their own take on it. And what they're left with is thematic incohesion, or it's just something that just doesn't make any sense. It's we'll do a Star Wars, and there's going to be laser swords. So we'll have laser swords, and we'll have a lot of robots, and there's going to be lasers that are not swords, and there's going to be flying stuff. People are going to be good at flying stuff, and that's the prequels. The opening of Star Wars. And I know it was made by the creator as well, but the prequels Star Wars I find is a much less compelling setting than the actual setting we're introduced to in the original trilogy, because the role of the Jedi is so dramatically different. They have laser swords, they have all sorts of powers and things like that, but the reason that the Jedi are so compelling in the original trilogy, I would say, is very different from the sort of super soldier presentation we get of them, of the calm, tranquil, meditative, no emotion, very boring characters we effectively get in the prequels. Like a well-written Jedi character, as the prequels envision them, is a pretty badly written character, period. I mean, they have no emotion, they don't get rattled. And so it's very interesting to see that when somebody apes a source material, you need to understand the core ideas of why it works, which is why the original one often is an outgrowth of individual ideas. And so everything ends up being consistent if it's done well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, yeah, I don't want to sound like I was being too hostile to the idea of imitation. I think what I would urge, though, is to use what I would call secondary sources as a gateway to primary sources.
Mm.
So, someone whose exposure to uh, elves and dwarves and so forth is Dungeons and Dragons and Warcraft and Warhammer, um, has sort of an impoverished view of them because what he or she is getting is a commercial adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, which is a single author's interpretation of many cultures' independent folk culture. I don't know what you want to call it. And, you know, as a result, like now there's this very fixed image that dwarves have Scottish accents, or that the orcs have green skin, and that orcs are sort of a an essential part of fantasy, which is very odd, right? They're probably the only real creation. That's too strong, but they are one of the biggest creations that Tolkien has are the orcs. I mean, they're nothing like goblins and folk stories, and there's the word orc is like a sea monster or something. Like it has no roots in actual cultural history, but now they are as endemic to fantasy as elves and dwarves, even though elves and dwarves had like 1,000 years of history already, at least, um, before Tolkien got to them. And, you know, I'm not saying people shouldn't have orcs in their settings. I'm just saying that, uh, you know,
Test your assumptions.
like for, yeah, right. Like, I mean, I feel like for the setting you're talking about, it would be crazy to make this horror setting without playing Ravenloft or Vampire the Masquerade or something.
Mm-hmm.
That would be irresponsible as a designer not to do them. But I think it would also be irresponsible to basically say, okay, I've read Ravenloft, I know everything I need to know about fantastical horror. Now I can sit down and write my setting. The hope is that you read it and then you're fascinated. Like, where does this idea of ghouls eating dead bodies come from, or whites paralyzing you? Like, what is the like cultural history that like this is plucking a string that's inside our cultural heritage, and where does that string lead us to? And generally, I think if you take the time to pursue that, I probably waste too much time on some but if you do take the time to pursue it, you end up with something I think a little bit better than if you just make a copy of a copy.
Absolutely. I mean, copies of copies, if you've ever used a copy machine, dear listener, don't come out as well as the original. And one reason is because if all you're doing is trying to copy something, all you can do in order to make it your own is to take away. If you want to add new things, they have to come from somewhere. And I talk about this a lot in the previous podcast, actually, to this episode. and one of the things I talk about there, I don't want to go into too many details, but just to catch you up, is the idea that the main reason for that is it hasn't been released yet, as of this recording. But the core idea is you have to go from somewhere for your new ideas and for your wider ideas and your broader ideas. If you can only look at the slice that you're given in whatever media you're familiar with, what's surrounding that? What if you want to do a slightly different take on it? What if you want to see how would a vampire act in a tavern? You might not see that in your Ravenloft adventure. And so what might give you some ideas for that? They have to come from somewhere. And they can only really come from two places: your head, which is a bastion of every movie you've ever seen and every book you've ever read, all the cliches clumping together regardless of genre. Or you can do research that is much more specific and showcases everybody's cool ideas and the originations of that. And that's really, really effective. Like, that's one reason why I wanted to ask you where a lot of your original ideas have come from in Primordia, because it's so interesting to follow that thread, and that thread leads you to other threads and to other threads, and soon you're building this rich world of surrounding ideas and finding overlaps between them. Like, and I don't want to go into, I'd love to talk about this topic, but I just talked about the last podcast, so we shouldn't spend too much time on it. But yeah, 100%
Yeah.
endorse research, 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 research. Okay, that's going to conclude part one of our interview with Mark. Mark, thanks so much for your time, and we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be recording next week's episode, the second half of this fantastic interview. I'm really looking forward to hearing more of what you got to say. Bye, guys. See you next time.